The whole city had already decided how Lucio Durante's story would end. Quietly, in a chair, with a blanket over his useless legs and someone else signing his name. His own people had carved up what he would leave behind before he was even gone, and not one of them thought to lower his voice while doing it. The night it all turned, there was no shouting on the lawn and no trouble down at the Calder. There was only a nurse, a bruised orange, and the sound of a man laughing for the first time in 2 years. By the next morning, the men who had written him off were the ones packing to run. What none of them thought to guard against was the simplest thing in the world. Vireo House had not heard a raised voice in a long time. It sat above the river, behind a wall of black iron, 40 rooms of cold marble, and colder quiet. And every one of them had learned to whisper. The curtains in the east study stayed drawn against the afternoon. Lucio preferred it that way. They told each other, though no one had actually asked him in months. He sat where they put him each morning in the tall chair by the unlit fire, a wool blanket squared over his knees by hands that were not his own. 2 years ago a car had gone off the coast road in the rain and taken the feeling from his legs, and everyone agreed, a good deal more than that. The Lucio Durante, who had once walked into a room and made it go silent, now needed to be turned, fed, and reminded what day it was. The reminding came from a small paper cup of pills, at 8, at noon, and at 6, delivered by a nurse whose face never moved. He was aware in the soft gray way he was aware of most things now, that he was slipping. A thought would begin in him, clear and hard the way thoughts used to come, and then the mist would roll across it before he could finish, and he would sit there holding the empty shape of something he had meant to say. The words he wanted arrived a beat late. The anger that used to keep him sharp had gone spongy and far away. He told himself, it was the injury. Everyone told him, it was the injury. A man loses the use of his legs, they said, and sometimes the mind grieves in its own way. And there was Dr. Emmerich with his soft gray voice to explain the science of it. And who was Lucio, to argue with a doctor when he could not always hold a fork? Sometimes in the thin hour before the morning cup, he came a little clearer, and in those minutes he remembered who he had been, and the remembering was almost worse than the fog. He remembered a harbor. He remembered making a room of hard men go quiet, with nothing but the way he set down a glass. He remembered his own voice, low and certain, deciding things. He reached for that man now, and closed his hand on smoke. Beyond the study door, the house ran on without him. Bastiano Ferro ran it. Bastiano had stood at Lucio's right hand for 11 years, had wept, or seemed to, at the hospital, and had quietly taken up every rein Lucio let fall. It was Bastiano who met the captains, now, Bastiano who moved the money, Bastiano who patted Lucio's shoulder each evening and said, "Rest, we have it handled, and you only have to get well." The getting well never seemed to come any closer, and Lucio, in the fog, had stopped expecting it to. That afternoon, Bastiano came in without knocking, which he had started doing sometime in the last year, and crouched beside the chair, so their eyes were level. It was the posture a man used with a child or a dog. "Good news," Bastiano said. "Signora Dre is owed a leave. Family matter, upstate. We have a temporary girl coming to cover the room until the proper replacement is vetted. Nobody important. She will feed you, and mind the schedule and be gone in a month." Lucio worked to shape the question. He could feel it there, whole, and then he had to drag it up through the wet wool, one word at a time. "Who?" he managed. The single word cost him more than it should have. "An agency girl. Vale, I think." "It hardly matters." Bastiano smiled the warm, practiced smile that no longer reached anywhere near his eyes. "You will barely notice her. That is rather the point of a good nurse. Quiet. Careful. There and not there." He straightened the blanket over Lucio's knees with his own hands. "You have had enough noise for one lifetime, old friend. Let us keep you peaceful." Something in the phrasing snagged at the edge of Lucio's fogged mind, Some small wrongness in the way a man wished quiet on you like a blessing, and then it slid away before he could hold it, the way everything slid away now. Bastiano squeezed his shoulder and said something about the accounts, and left him to the drawn curtains and the ticking clock. Down on the gravel, a small, tired car was already climbing the long drive toward the house. Inside it, entirely unaware that she was the one variable 11 years of careful planning had forgotten to account for, sat a woman with an orange in her coat pocket and a bad habit of opening other people's curtains. Linnea Vale had been warned about the house before she ever saw it. The agency woman had lowered her voice on the phone. "Difficult family," she had said. "Very private. The patient does not speak much, and the staff. Do the work, keep your head down, collect your envelope, and do not ask questions above your station." Linnea had said yes, of course, and privately decided, as she always did, to ignore roughly half of it. She was 31 years old. She had nursed her own father through the long, cruel years of his illness, until he died the winter before last, and she had learned one thing at that bedside, that no agency could teach her, and no manager could take away. A quiet, calm patient was very often not a peaceful one. Very often it was simply a person who had stopped believing anyone in the world was still listening. She came up the drive in her rattling little car and took the measure of the place. Black gates, curtains drawn on a bright day, 2 large men who watched her park and did not offer to help with her bag. She got out, hauled her own bag, and thought, with the small, stubborn spark that had gotten her through worse rooms than this one, well, somebody in there has forgotten how to open a window. They passed her through the house like a parcel. A cold woman in a starched gray uniform introduced herself as Signora Dre and walked her down a corridor, reciting the schedule in a flat, closed voice. 8 and noon and 6. No exceptions. The doses are measured out in advance, and you do not adjust them, you do not delay them, and you do not question them. Dr. Emmerich attends to all of that. Linnea said yes, and yes, and yes. Then the study door opened, and she saw him, and the mild, agreeable voice went right out of her head. The agency had said a difficult patient. They had not said a man sealed alive inside his own body. He sat in the dark, with a blanket squared on his knees, like something arranged for a viewing, and his eyes came up to hers, slow and dull, dragging, as if even the act of looking had to travel a long way to reach the surface. And Linnea felt her whole chest tighten the way it had at her father's bed in the last bad months, because she knew that look. It was not the look of a mind that was gone. It was the look of a sharp mind wrapped in wet wool, hammering and hammering on the inside of a wall that no one else in the house could hear. "Well," she said, and it was not to Dre, and not quite to him, and she crossed the room in 4 strides and took hold of the heavy curtains and hauled them wide before anyone could tell her not to. Gray river light poured in and filled the room. Behind her, Signora Dre made a small, scandalized sound, and Lucio Durante flinched hard against the sudden brightness. He actually looked at her. "There," she said, planting her hands on her hips and surveying him like a landlord surveying a tenant she intended to keep. "You are not a corpse, Signor Durante. Whatever this room is trying to tell you, I can see the confusion, mind. It is very committed to the theme, but corpses do not scowl, and you are scowling at me quite beautifully. And that is the first genuinely good sign I have had all day." Silence. Dre's mouth opened and shut. One of the large men in the hall leaned his head in through the door to see who on earth was talking to the boss like that, and found only a small plain woman in a travel coat, tugging a second curtain open, entirely unbothered. And Lucio Durante stared at this bright, loud, unafraid person who had let the sun into his tomb, and somewhere far down behind his eyes, something that had been asleep for 2 years, opened a single lid and looked back at her. She spent the rest of the afternoon undoing the room. She propped the window until she turned his heavy chair so that he faced the garden instead of the wall. She talked the whole time. A bright, easy stream, about nothing at all. the state of the roads on the way up, her opinion of anyone who would decorate 40 separate rooms in the precise color of wet cement, the shocking crimes committed against tea in houses like this one. She did not once speak to him as though he were slow. She spoke to him as though he were a difficult, intelligent, deeply irritated man who was simply having an unusually bad decade, which was, as it happened, exactly what he was, and exactly what no one under that roof had treated him as since the water took his legs. At 6 o'clock, she went to bring the little paper cup of pills herself, because she wanted a look at the chart. She read the label on the bottle, then she read it again, more slowly. She glanced at the man in the chair, at the particular thick, sluggish quality of the fog in his eyes, and then back at the label, and a small cold question began, very quietly, in the back of her mind, to take a shape she did not like. Dr. Emmerich sets the dose, Signora Dre said, from the doorway. She had come back without a sound, and she was watching Linnea's hands the way a cat watches a bird. Her voice had gone very flat. You have no reason on this earth to be reading that. Force of habit, Linnea said warmly, and smiled her most useless, harmless smile, and handed the cup across. But that night, alone in the narrow servants' room they had given her, she sat on the edge of the hard bed for a long time, thinking about the label and the fog and the flatness in Dre's voice and the way every single person in this beautiful, frightened house seemed to want the man in the chair kept exactly, precisely as quiet as he already was. She got the first one out of him on the third day, and it undid her a little. How hard she had to work for it. She had been reading to him, not a book. She had found a small stack of the household's own grim correspondence, left carelessly on a side table, letters threatening in that stiff, careful, lawyerly way such letters are, and on pure mischief. Because the room was a tomb and she could not stand one more silent hour of it, she had begun to read one aloud in the voice of a mournful opera villain. One hand pressed flat to her heart. It was ridiculous. She knew it was ridiculous. She did it anyway if it took a shovel. On the word gravest, drawn out into 3 long, tragic syllables, Lucio Durante made a sound. It was rusty, dragged up from somewhere deep, that had not been used in a very long time, and it cracked clean across the middle like an old hinge. But it was a laugh. His own laugh, the first in 2 years, and the look that crossed his ruined gray face directly afterward was not amusement at all. It was pure astonishment. Linnea lowered the letter slowly. She did not make a fuss, or call anyone, or even smile too wide. She had learned that at her father's bed as well, that you do not startle a wild thing at the exact moment it has decided, against all its own better judgment, to trust you. There he is, she said softly instead. I was starting to think they had you stuffed and mounted you. Lucio said, the single word, and it came out clearer than any word had come out of him in months, clear enough that he heard it himself. He tried a second word. You are going to get yourself fired. Very likely, she agreed. She came and sat on the low ottoman in front of his chair, close, unafraid, and she took the orange out of her coat pocket and began to peel it. She split it into pieces and folded one into his slow, half-willing fingers, closing his hand around it for him. But I have been fired from finer houses than this, Signor, and I keep to one rule regardless, so you may as well learn it now. I do not leave a man where I found him, and I found you, sulking in the dark like a bear with a splinter in its paw. She held his gaze. You are not dying. You have half this house convinced you are dying, and the other half hoping. But you are not. You are terribly, spectacularly bored, and somebody, Signor Durante, has made very sure you stay exactly that way. She said the last of it lightly, tossing it off like a joke, the way she said most true things. But she was watching his face when she said it, and she saw the words go down past the fog, and she saw him do the thing no one in that house had seen him do in 2 years. She saw him think. Here was the thing she had noticed by then, and could not yet explain. That morning, the noon cup had come late, delayed the better part of an hour by some small fuss in the kitchen. And in that late hour, in the gap before the pills, Lucio Durante had been clearer than she had seen him yet. He had followed her whole ridiculous performance to the end. And once, only once, watching his own hand, as if it belonged to a stranger, he had moved the fingers of his right hand closed and open again, slowly, deliberately, and on purpose. Then the cup had come. And within the hour the wet wool had rolled back down over him like a tide coming in, and by evening he was slow and gray and gone once more. She had told herself she imagined it. She was still telling herself that. She was tidying the letters back into their guilty little stack when she felt the change in the room, that old animal instinct a woman develops for the exact moment she is being watched. She turned. Bastiano Ferro was standing in the doorway, and he was not looking at Lucio at all. He was looking at her, at the curtains standing open, at the peeled orange, at the faint, impossible flush of color that had come up in the sick man's gray face. And he was smiling, the warm, pleasant, practiced smile that never once reached his eyes. And Linnea understood, all at once, with a cold, small drop of the stomach, that in 3 days she had made herself extremely interesting to precisely the wrong person in the world. "Signorina Vale," Bastiano said, ever so pleasantly. "A word, I think, in private." The word Bastiano wanted turned out to be a great many of them, all pleasant and not one of them kind. He took her instead down the long gallery, his hands folded neatly behind his back, like a patient man showing a guest around grounds he happened to own. He said he was sorry, truly sorry, for her bereavement, and the sorrow in his voice was so smooth and so complete, and so entirely without any warmth underneath it, that it frightened her far more than shouting ever could have. "You care about your patients," he said. "It is a rare quality, and an admirable one. I only worry, Signorina Vale, and I say this as a kindness that you care rather past your understanding. Signor Durante is not a well man. His mind is fragile, sudden light, excitement. These are not kindnesses to a man in his condition. They are cruelties, dressed up as kindness. Dr. Emmerich has spent 2 careful years building a peace around that man. I would truly hate to watch a temporary girl pull it all down in 3 days out of forgive me sentiment." "Of course, Signor Ferro," Linnea said. She folded her hands in front of her and arranged her face into the blank, obedient, slightly stupid thing she could see. "He wanted, I only meant to keep him comfortable. I will mind the schedule and keep to the room." "Good." He turned from the portrait and gave her the full warmth of that smile, and up close it was. A terrible thing, all the muscles moving correctly around 2 cold and steady eyes. "You have an excellent reference from the agency. Spotless, in fact. It would be such a pity for anything to trouble it." He let that hang in the air, exactly 1 heartbeat too long. A nurse, after all, is only ever as employable as her last word of character. "But I am sure you know all that. You seem a sensible girl." She did know all that. That was the whole trouble. And he had found it out about her in under a minute. She had no husband and no children, no family left living, no cushion of money under her, and no soft place to land. She had exactly one thing between herself and the street, and it was the clean, unremarkable good name that earned her the next envelope. He had found the single wall in the world she could be backed against, and he had walked her calmly up to it, and he had smiled the entire time, and now they both knew that he knew. She spent the next 2 days being perfectly, beautifully, quietly obedient and watching absolutely everything. She watched Dr. Emmerich when he came, who never once, not a single time, met the eyes of the patient. He was so carefully regimenting. She asked him, mildly in her most harmless voice. Emmerich told her, without quite looking at her, that it was not her concern, that the pharmacology was complex and settled, and she watched Renzo, Renzo drove the cars and stood at the doors and said almost nothing to anyone. A big weathered slab of a man with old white scars across his knuckles. She noticed him because he was the single person in that entire house who spoke to Lucio like a man instead of a task. He would pause by the chair on his way through and say, "Low morning, boss." Once he caught Linnea watching him do it, and he went still and looked at her a long, level, measuring moment, and something wordless moved between them in that look, a shared unease that neither was ready to say out loud in that house. It was Lucio himself, in one clear stolen hour before a late cup, who at last gave her the true shape of the thing she had been circling. "They come with papers," he said. His voice was low and it dragged, but the words underneath it were his own, chosen, deliberate. "Bastiano brings the papers. Sign here, Lucio, just here, for the family, for your protection, while you are unwell. My hand is not always." He stopped, and something surfaced in his expression that was worse than fog. It was shame. "It shakes. Some days I cannot make it do what I mean." So he steadies it. He puts the pen in it, and he steadies my own hand. And I sign, and I do not always remember after what it was I put my name to. I was so tired, Signorina. God forgive me. I was so tired that I was glad. Glad to let another man carry it. Do you understand what I am telling you? I helped him. I signed my own life away, one grateful page at a time, and I thanked him for taking the weight. Linnea knelt down in front of the chair, the way she had knelt so many times at her father's bed, and she thought about a fragile mind and a careful peace, and a good and dangerous man made grateful, made glad, made eager to hand away his entire life one foggy signature at a time. And she thought, with a hard, cold clarity that had nothing whatever to do with sentiment, that she did not believe one single word Bastiano Ferro had said to her in that long gallery. That night, she palmed the 8 o'clock pill. She stood at the little sink in the corner of the study, with the paper cup in her hand, and the tablet hidden in her curled fingers, and she did not put it into his mouth. She tipped water to his lips, and she let him believe he had taken it, and her heart beat so hard and so high in her throat that she was certain the whole cold listening house could hear it through the walls. She had no proof of anything yet. She had a suspicion and a stolen tablet closed in her fist, and one thing more, sharper than either. She had the sudden, total, frightening certainty that she needed to know, before another single day of this was allowed to pass, exactly what these smiling people were feeding the man she had come into this house to keep alive. She learned what she was so afraid to learn the very next morning, and it came up slowly out of the tall chair. She had held back the evening dose, and then at the gray edge of dawn, the first of the morning. And by 9 o'clock the man in the chair was someone she had never met. The fog did not lift, all at once. It burned off the way fog truly burns off a river, slowly, unevenly, from the edges inward, and what it uncovered as it went was a terrible thing to stand and watch. It was a person surfacing. It was a man swimming up from very deep water, and beginning with rising horror to understand how long he had been down there, and how nearly he had stopped trying to rise. He looked at his own hands first. He turned them over in his lap and studied them. Then, with a concentration that stood, he closed the fingers of his right hand slowly into a fist and opened them again, on purpose, cleanly, and he made a sound that was one half a laugh and one half something inside him, breaking clean through. "I can feel that," he whispered. He set it to his hand, and then he lifted his eyes to her, and they were wet and wide and entirely, blazingly present. "Signorina, I can feel my hand. I can feel my own hand." "I know," Linnea said. Her own face was streaming, and she did not trouble to hide it or wipe it. "I thought that you might." "How long?" His hand came off his own lap and caught her by the wrist. "How long have I been like this? Tell me the truth of it." "Everyone under this roof lies to me. They have lied to me so long and so gently. that I stopped hearing it as lying, and I have been too far under to know the difference. How long, Signorina Vale? How long have I been drowning in that chair while they stood around me and told me, kindly, that I was only resting? She thought of the light thing she had tossed at him 3 days back, half a joke, that he was not dying, that someone had made very sure he stayed that way. She had said it. It was not a light thing now. It was standing in the middle of the room between them, and it was the plainest, hardest fact in the house. I do not believe you are sick, Signor, she said quietly, holding his eyes. I believe you are being kept. There is something going into those cups that has no business being there, or else there is a great deal too much of something that has some small business being there. I have watched it now for days. When I hold the cups back, you come up. You come back. When I give them, within the hour you go under. Again, a sick man does not run on a switch like that. A poisoned one does. Somebody in this house has been putting you to sleep 3 times a day, and calling it your medicine, and calling it grief, and calling it the injury, and letting you thank them for it. She watched the word poisoned go down into him and change his whole face, by slow degrees, disbelief giving way to horror and horror hardening at last into a third thing beneath both, a cold, still gathering thing. She recognized it, because it was the thing the whole city had at one time been so very afraid of. It was Lucio Durante, coming back into his own eyes. Bastiano, he said. It was not a question. It was a name being written down somewhere permanent. Footsteps in the corridor. Quick, hard-heeled, coming. Linnea moved, before she had finished thinking. She put her 2 hands flat on his shoulders and pressed him gently back into the chair and bent to his ear and breathed. Go under now. Do not let him see you, please. And Lucio Durante, who had waited 2 years in the dark for this one clear hour, closed it away again. He did it like a man shutting the door on a fire in his own house. She watched him do it. He let the light go out of his eyes, on purpose. He let his jaw loosen, and his head tip, and his hands go slack and empty in his lap. By the time Dr. Emmerich pushed open the study door with his soft gray questions already forming, there was nothing in that room to find but a fragile invalid dozing in the mild light of the window, and a plain temporary nurse tidying the sill, and no reason on earth for a careful man to look twice. Emmerich looked twice anyway. He stood a moment too long in the doorway, and Linnea kept her hands busy and her face empty. Then he crossed the room and set down the noon cup himself, and watched, personally, while she fitted it to the patient's slack lips, and watched the patient swallow. Lucio's eyes found hers over the rim of that cup as the wool rolled down over him once more, and in the last clear instant, before it took him under, there was fury in them, and grief, and beneath both of those a new and terrible patience. The patience of a man who has just been handed a reason to live and intends to spend it carefully. They knew now, the 2 of them, and knowing, in a house like this one, with people like these in it, was easily the most dangerous thing that either of them owned. After that they stole their hours like thieves, and in the stolen hours they built the truth up between them, a piece at a time, and every single piece was worse than the one before it. Linnea learned to read the doses. She learned exactly how much she could skim and hold back to buy him a clear window without leaving a mark on the count that Dre had drilled into her. She learned which hours the house went thin, the dead middle of the afternoon, the gray slot before dawn, and she learned to bring him up in those hours and to have him safely under again before the house filled back in around them. And in those stolen windows, Lucio remembered. He remembered in fragments at first. Bastiano at his elbow through the long fog, always so gentle, always so patient. For your protection, Lucio, just here, old friend. The family needs a signature, and you are not well enough today to read the whole of it, so let me hold the pen with you. Piece by piece, the documents came back to him. He had signed away the authority to move the accounts. He had signed away the authority to speak for the family to the captains. He had signed, God help him. And this was the one that stopped his breath when it surfaced. The authority to direct his own medical care so that the very drugging that fogged him had been made by his own fogged hand, perfectly and unchallengeably legal. He built a man who could not say no, Lucio said, very low, staring at nothing. First he built him. Then he went to that man and asked him for everything he had, one small no at a time, on the days that man was too far under to refuse. Until there were no no's left anywhere in me. It was Linnea who found the last piece, and she found it the way a person always finds the very worst things, entirely by accident, in a dark hallway, at exactly the wrong hour of the night. She had gone down for hot water a little after midnight, and she heard Bastiano's voice, coming through the half-open door of the study that had been Lucio's, and was now, so plainly, and so completely, his own. He was on the telephone. His voice was easy and low and warm. She stopped in the dark of the corridor, and she did not breathe. The Sarki's papers are ready, Bastiano was saying. All of them. The territory transfers clean on the 1st of the month. The moment the incompetency filing clears the court, Halvard gets the river frontage and the whole North Dock, as agreed. We split the rest between us, and everyone goes home rich and quiet. A pause, while the other man spoke. Then a soft, comfortable, untroubled little laugh that turned the blood in Linnea's body to river water. Lucio? No. No, Lucio is not a problem. Lucio has not been a problem in a long, long time. You know that, after the papers are signed and witnessed. Well, a man in his condition, his heart, his lungs, the strain of it all. These things happen to invalids every day. No one on this earth is going to look twice at a sick man in a chair who finally, peacefully, stops fighting. Least of all his own doctor, who will sign the certificate himself. There it was. Said out loud, in a warm and easy and untroubled voice, in the dark. Not only the fog, not only the theft of the accounts and the docks and the river. The end of it, the last page. Once the ink was dry on the transfer, the man in the chair was to be allowed, quietly and on schedule, and to slip under one final time and not come up. She got herself back up the stairs, without any memory of climbing them. She woke Lucio in the gray hour before the dawn, holding back the morning cup, and she knelt down in front of the chair, and she told him all of it, every word, the Sarkis family, the river frontage and the North Dock. The incompetency, filing, the 1st of the month, the doctor who would sign the certificate. She made herself say the last part plainly, because he had asked her, always, for the truth of things. And she owed him the truth of this even though it broke something in her to hand it to him, and she watched it land. She watched the man she had spent a week digging up out of the wool receive, fully awake, the news that his oldest friend in the world had arranged to be rid of him, the way another man arranges a delivery, and had laughed softly while he did it. He did not rage. That was the thing that told her more than anything else could have, who he truly was underneath all of it. Lucio Durante went very still and very quiet, and every last shred of the fog was gone from his eyes, now burned clean off, and when he finally spoke his voice was low and level and completely, frighteningly, awake. The 1st of the month, he said. That is 9 days from now. Lucio? She reached up and took his hand in both of hers. There is a thing you have to understand, and you have to understand it before you do anything at all. The moment they suspect you are surfacing, the moment any one of them catches you awake, they will not wait for the 1st of the month. They will finish it that same night, and change no other part of their plan, because a dead invalid suits them just as well early as late. And there is more, and you are not going to like it. She made herself hold his eyes. It is me. I am the reason you are surfacing. There is no other explanation for it, and Bastiano is not a stupid man. He already knows I care too much. He watched the color come into your face over an orange. If he works out what I have actually been doing with those cups. She stopped. She did not need to finish it. And she could not quite make herself. A temporary girl with no family and no money and one destroyable name, who had discovered exactly the wrong secret, alone, inside a house that made its problems disappear as a matter of routine. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Then his slow fingers closed around hers, deliberate and certain, and it was the first real promise his body had let him make in 2 years. Then he does not work it out, Lucio said. Then we give him nothing to see. His grip tightened. You brought me back from the dead, Signorina Vale, laughing. Of all the ridiculous ways there are to raise a man from the dead, you did it with a stolen orange and a stack of somebody's threats, read out in a bad opera voice. I am not going to sit in this chair and let that man make you disappear for the crime of waking me up. He drew a breath, and something crossed his face that was almost terribly, in that gray hour, a smile. 9 days. And on the 9th day, we are going to be very, very awake, the both of us, and we are going to take back every single thing he stole from me, while I sat here smiling in my sleep and thanking him for it. But first, Signorina, you are going to have to teach me something. And quickly. You are going to have to teach me how to look dead again on command, and how to hold it under his eyes, and how not to flinch. I am told I have gotten badly out of practice at pretending to be less than I am. Down the long hall, somewhere in the sleeping house, a clock began to strike the hour, slow and even, and neither of them moved through the whole of it, and the count had already begun. A man in a chair cannot fight a house full of armed men by himself. Lucio understood that with the first genuinely clear breath he took, and he understood, too, that the single weapon he had left in the world was the one thing Bastiano had been most careful, over 2 patient years, to strip away from him. Hands, loyal hands, inside the house that would answer to him and not to the man who had arranged to be rid of him. There was exactly one candidate for it, and betting wrong on the man would be the end of them both before nightfall. Renzo, Lucio said, when Linnea asked him who they could possibly trust inside these walls. If there is one man left under this roof who is still mine, one man Bastiano did not think to buy, it is Renzo. He carried my father before he carried me, and if I have read him wrong after all these years, then I have read everything wrong, and you and I are already dead, Signorina, and simply slow to hear the news. Linnea brought Renzo to the room in the thin gray slot before dawn, when the house slept, and the night watchers had gone dull and careless, and she did it on the flimsy excuse of a window that would not close. She let him in, and she shut the door behind him and set her back against it. And Lucio Durante, who had spent 2 full years teaching the entire world that he was gone, lifted his head off the wing of the chair and looked. The big man let him see, all at once, the whole living man underneath. For a long moment Renzo did not move at all. His weathered slab of a face went slack, and then it went stricken. And then something worked across it that Linnea would not have believed that kind of hard, closed face could do. His eyes filled and spilled over, and he did not seem to notice. "Boss," he said, and his voice broke clean in half on the single word. "You are in there. Sweet God in heaven, you are in there. I knew it. Something in me knew it, and I called myself a fool for it every morning. I have been in here the whole time, Renzo," Lucio said, very quietly. "Drowning for 2 years, while you brought the cars around to a dead man, and said good morning to a dead man because you could not make yourself stop. I heard you. Every single day I heard you say it. You were the only voice in this house that still spoke to me, as though I were a person owed the time of day. I am not going to forget that. Whatever happens now, I am not ever going to forget that." The big man went down onto one knee beside the chair as though something in his legs had simply been cut, and he took Lucio's hand in both of his enormous scarred ones, and for a moment none of the 3 of them could speak at all. Linnea turned herself toward the gray window and gave the 2 men the privacy of it. When Renzo could talk again, it came out of him in a low flood. Years of it. He had known. Not the how of it, but he had known in his gut that something was rotten at the heart of the house. He had watched Bastiano Ferro grow fat and easy, and Renzo had no proof he could name, and no lucid master he could bring it to. And he was not the only one, he said. Half the old crew felt the wrongness of it. They did not love Bastiano. They had never loved Bastiano. They obeyed him because there was no longer anyone else in the house to obey. There is someone else to obey now, Lucio said. And then he said the thing out loud. The thing that could not be taken back once it had been spoken into another man's hearing. The thing that turned him in that gray hour from a victim hiding inside his own ruined body into a man at war. Listen to me, both of you. I am not going to slip quietly out of this world so that Bastiano Ferro can sell my river to the Sarkis and split the rest of my life's work with Halvard over a good bottle of my own wine. That is not going to happen. I am going to take back every single thing that man has stolen from me while I slept, and I am going to do it in the light, in front of the whole family, in front of every captain he thinks he owns, so that when it is finished, there is not one shred of doubt left in any man's mind about who in this house is alive and who is finished. His slow hand closed hard over Renzo's. But hear the rest of it, because the rest of it matters more. The woman, Signorina Vale. Whatever else happens, whatever it costs, whatever way it breaks, nothing touches her. She is the only reason I am awake to fight at all. If this comes apart on us, Renzo, if it goes wrong in that room, you forget me. You get her out the river door, and you put her somewhere. He will never find her, and you keep her breathing. That is not a request I am making of you. That is the last order I will ever give you if it comes to it. On my life, boss, Renzo said, and there was no hesitation anywhere in it. On my life. Later, when Renzo had gone, Linnea peeled an orange and put a piece of it into Lucio's hand, and this time his fingers closed around it entirely on their own, sure and quick, and he looked down at that small private victory of his own returning body, and then up at her, and something passed between the two of them that had nothing whatever to do with nursing. You are getting stronger, she said. You are a dangerous woman, Signorina Vale, he answered, and there was the ghost of that dry buried humor in it now. You walked into a tomb, with an orange in your pocket, and you opened the curtains, and now there is going to be a war fought in it. I hope to God you understand what it is you have started here. I told you my rule the first week, she said. I do not leave a man where I found him. The door opened without a knock, and it was Renzo, back far too soon, and the look on his broad face killed the small warmth in the room where it stood. It moved, he said, low and fast. Something spooked him, or something suits him. I cannot tell which, but it moved. Bastiano is calling the captains in, all of them. There is to be a family council, here, in the house, to put your affairs in proper order, he is saying, before the filing, and boss. He hesitated, and it was the hesitation that frightened Linnea more than the words. Signora Dre has been recalled off her leave. She is back tomorrow, a full week early. The one person in this whole house who would know in a single glance across a room that you are surfacing is coming home ahead of her time, and I have been at this long enough to tell you. That is no accident of the calendar. They had one day of grace before the cold woman came back, and Renzo bought them the whole heart of it. He put his own bulk on the study door, and he turned the other watchers out onto errands, and for the length of one long, clear, stolen afternoon, Lucio Durante was simply a man again, awake in his own house, with no one watching who wished him ill. Linnea spent the gift of that afternoon on the single thing he asked her for. The one thing he had not dared to ask another living soul in 2 years. Take me outside, he said. I want to feel the sun on my face. I have not felt the sun on my face since before the water took my legs. Do you understand that? Not once in 2 years. They kept me always in the dark of that study, for my own peace, and I am told the garden is still out there behind the house. I would like to go and find out whether I still remember what the color green looks like. So she unlocked the tall garden doors, and she wheeled him out and down the long ramp that had been, and she took him out into the walled garden above the Calder. The afternoon light came down soft and gold through the old lime trees and lay across his upturned face. And Lucio Durante closed his eyes and breathed in, like a man surfacing from very deep water, which, she thought, was exactly and precisely what he was. "There it is," he murmured. "The green. I had started to believe they had taken that away from me too, along with all the rest. I had started to believe I had made it up. They talked in that garden, the two of them, more freely than they had yet let themselves." Renzo drifted near, and prompted gently, told her about the house that had been. The man who knew every soldier's mother by name and asked after her by name. The man who had never once needed to raise his voice in anger, because his quiet was worse than any other man's shouting, and everyone knew it. Half the men still carried that Lucio inside them, Renzo said. Half of them at least. Ostiano ruled the house now, he ruled it hard, but he had never for one single day of his life owned it. That was a thing worth knowing, and Lucio filed it away carefully behind his clearing eyes, because a man planning to face a room full of captains needs to know exactly which of them are only obeying and waiting and would turn the moment they were given half a reason to. And Linnea, warmed by the rare sun, found herself telling him her own. "My father taught me the trick of it," she said, turning a curl of orange peel over and over in her fingers. "The being funny at deathbeds. He was the funniest man I ever knew in my life, and he was ill for a long time, a very long time. The slow kind. The kind that takes a man away from you a little piece at a time. And somewhere in the middle of it, he made a decision. He decided that the illness could have his legs and his strength and his appetite and, in the end, his breath. But it was not going to have the laughing. That was the one thing he would not sign over to it. So we laughed. All the way through it, right down to the very end, we laughed in that little room, because it turned out to be the one single thing the illness could not reach in and take." She was quiet a moment. "And then he died anyway, the way they do, and I found out that I had gone and given the laughing to him, along with everything else I had. I have not really laughed since. 2 years. Near enough. I make my living, making frightened, dying people laugh, signor. And then I go home to a quiet flat where there is no one, and I do not laugh at all." She looked up at him, and seemed surprised at her own honesty, until a bad-tempered bear with a splinter in his paw made that awful rusty, broken sound at me over a lawyer's letter. And I went out into the corridor afterward, and I laughed until I had to hold the wall, and I frightened poor Signora Dre half to death, and I did not care, because it was mine again. For 1 minute, it was mine again. Lucio looked at her for a long moment across the gold garden. "Then we are even, you and I," he said quietly. "You gave me back my life, and it seems I gave you back your laugh. And neither one of us knew, all this while, that we were dying of the very same thing. The afternoon, filled with sound, after that real sound, in a garden that had forgotten it." He laughed, fully now more than once, and twice Renzo laughed too, huge and helpless, and astonished at himself. She peeled another orange and made him do the villain opera voice with her, and he turned out to be wickedly, mercilessly funny once he was fully awake, dry and quick, and a little cruel. And she understood at last precisely what the whole city had once been so afraid of, because a man that sharp, with that much warmth burning off him, was the single most dangerous kind of man there was. He reached out, slow but perfectly sure, and tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear, and she went entirely still under his hand, and neither one of them made the smallest pretense that it was nursing. "When this is over," he began low. "Do not," she said, "just as low, please. Do not promise me a when, Lucio, not in this house, not while there are 9 days on the clock and a cold woman coming home tomorrow. Promise me nothing yet. I cannot carry a promise and the cups at the same time." He let his hand fall away, but he smiled, and the smile was a promise, regardless of what she had asked, and they both knew it. Behind them, unheard over, their own rare laughter, a car came up the long drive and stopped on the gravel. Through the tall window of the study, a starched gray figure stepped down out of it and stood a moment on the stones, looking up at the shuttered face of the house with a small, precise frown, drawing her brows together, her head tilted, as though she had heard, all the way from the road, the one sound that house was never, the sound of the patient laughing. Signora Dre had come home a week early, and from the very first minute of it, before she had so much as taken off her gloves, she was already looking hard at everything. Soline Dre unmade their fragile piece in under an hour, and she did it without raising her voice or making a single accusation, which was somehow worse than if she had. She went to the chart before she had even taken off her coat. She stood at the foot of the chair, and she read the dose counts down the page, and then she read them a second time, slower, her flat, pale eyes moving from the numbers to the man in the chair and back again. The man in the chair lay slack and gray and foggy and drooling faintly at the corner of his mouth, entirely on cue, because Linnea had put him under early and deep, that very morning, precisely against this homecoming. Dre studied him a long, long moment. She did not believe it. Linnea, standing quiet by the window with her hands folded and her face empty, could see the woman not believing it, could see the arithmetic running behind the flat eyes. But not believing a thing is not the same as being able to prove it. And so the two women took each other's measure across the sick man's chair, a state of perfect courtesy, with total war running underneath it. They had, until the council, whenever Bastiano chose to call it, and they did not know the day, so they spent every stolen minute they could steal arming for it. Renzo brought the first of them at midnight, a small, heavy thing, wrapped up in an oiled rag, and he put it into Lucio's hand without a word. It was a digital recorder, cheap and black, and on it, when Lucio thumbed it on low in the dark, was Bastiano Ferro's own warm and easy voice, closing out the deal on the telephone. The Sarkis papers, the river frontage, and the North Dock. The first of the month, and then, into the small dark room, the soft, comfortable little laugh, and a man in his condition, and these things happen every day, and no one is going to look twice. Renzo had stood outside that study door on the night in question, and held the recorder to the crack of it. Lucio sat and listened to his own quiet removal, being arranged in the voice of the man who had carried his father's coffin, and his face went slowly to gray stone. And when it was done, he pressed the recorder off and held it a long moment in his fist and said nothing at all. The second weapon Linnea took herself, and it very nearly ended her. On the third day of Dre's return, with Emmerich turned to the basin and the water going, Linnea opened his black bag, where it sat on the chair, and found 3 small unlabeled vials that matched nothing at all, written anywhere on the official chart. She got 2 of them closed inside her fist, in the space of a single breath, and she had the bag shut again, and her hands folded before the water stopped. But when Emmerich turned back, drying his soft gray hands on a towel, he looked at her. He looked at her a beat too long, his round eyes flat and unreadable, and he looked at the bag and then at her apron, and he said, "Nothing, whatever." And that saying of nothing was the most frightening thing that had happened to her yet. Because she understood, in that held silence, that Emmerich now knew the temporary nurse had put her hands where a temporary nurse's hands had no business being, and that he would carry that knowledge straight to the only man who would want to hear it. The third weapon was the papers themselves, and it was Renzo who got them. Renzo, who had watched every door in that house for 11 years, and knew the working of every lock in it. At 2 in the morning he put the whole file into Lucio's hands. The powers of attorney. The medical directive that made the drugging legal by the victim's own signature. The transfer of the river frontage to a Sarkis holding company. And on the bottom, drawn up clean and dated and needing only a physician's signature and a room full of captains to witness it lawful, the petition of incompetency itself. Each page was worse than the one above it. Together they made a map of one man's patient, methodical, almost loving theft of another man's entire life. He did not even hate me, Lucio said, staring down at the pages. And it was the closest his level voice had come to breaking. That is the piece of it I cannot get past, Signorina. If he had hated me, I could understand the whole of it. Hate I know how to answer. But he did not hate me at all. He loved me, I think. He simply sat down one day and did the arithmetic and decided that I was worth a great deal more to him asleep than awake. And then he was gentle with me every day for 2 years while he quietly did away with me. And then, the next morning, the floor gave way beneath them, exactly as she had feared it would. Emmerich went to Bastiano. Of course he did. Linnea felt the temperature of the whole house change between 1 hour and the next. The watchers were back doubled on the study door. Renzo was sent, suddenly on a long errand down to the North Docks that would keep him gone the better part of the day and put him out of the house. And then Bastiano himself came to the study, smiling his warm dead smile, and told Linnea, in the kindest possible voice, that her services would no longer be required after the family gathering that very evening. A car would take her back to the city. Signora Dre would resume full charge of the patient. Tonight. And he did so hope, he said, for her own sake, that she had not gone and troubled herself unduly over matters that were so very far above her station, and so entirely not her concern. The council was not 9 days away. It was not 8. It was tonight, and she was to be gone, and safely away. Before it was over, they had 1 throw left, and no time at all to plan it clean. In the last stolen minutes of the afternoon, with Dre somewhere in the corridor, and the doubled watchers on the door, and the car already ordered, Linnea knelt by the chair, and the two of them made the whole of it fast and desperate, in whispers, foreheads nearly touching. She would not put him under tonight. She would give Bastiano exactly the drugged and finished invalid he was expecting to have wheeled in and displayed before the captains. And at the precise moment, Bastiano stood up before the whole assembled family and made his fraud lawful with his own mouth, calling for the doctor's signature on the petition. Lucio would come up out of the fog in front of every man in the room, with the recorder and the vials and the file of papers. And he would gamble, the last thing he had left in the world, on a single bet. On the bet that a room full of hard men who had never once loved Bastiano Ferro would choose a living Durante over a comfortable lie. And if they do not choose you, Linnea whispered, she had to make herself ask it. If you stand up in that room and they do not turn, what then, Lucio? Then Renzo takes you out the river door before the first sign of trouble, and you run, and you do not look back, and you laugh again someday, for the both of us, somewhere far from here. He caught her hand and held it hard against his chest, over the steady, living beat of him. But they will choose me, Signorina Vale. I know these men. I made most of them. And Bastiano has forgotten the one thing you taught me that first week, over an orange, when you called me a bear with a splinter. He has forgotten that a man everyone in the room believes is already finished, is the single most dangerous man in that room. He looked past her toward the door, and she watched, with her heart in her throat, as he began deliberately to let the fog come down over his own eyes, a living man drawing his own gray shroud up over his face by choice. Wheel me in, Linnea. Let us go down there and be underestimated one last time. They gathered in the great hall at dusk, and Bastiano Ferro had staged the whole of it like a coronation, dressed up as a mercy. 15 captains stood, ranged along the cold marble of the long room. At the head of the hall, a long table had been set, and on it lay the file of papers, a heavy fountain pen laid across them, and a decanter that no one had yet been invited to drink from. A lean, quiet, expensive man stood a little apart from the captains, and Linnea understood, without being told, that this was Halvard Sarkis's own emissary. Come in person to see the river change hands. Dr. Emmerich hovered near the table. Signora Dre stood against the far wall, upright and flat-eyed, and in the very center of it all, wheeled to his appointed place, by a plain nurse in a traveling coat, sat Lucio Durante, slack and gray and gone, a wool blanket squared just so across his useless knees. Bastiano spoke, and he spoke beautifully. He spoke of grief, and of duty, and of the long, slow, terrible decline of a great and beloved man. He was gentle about it. That was the obscene thing. He grieved Lucio while he slid the petition of incompetency an inch closer to the edge of the table. "It is a mercy," Bastiano said softly, into the silence of the great hall, "to let him rest at last. He is tired." He would not have wanted to be seen going on like this. He let his gaze drift, mild and dismissive, over the nurse by the chair. "You may take the girl's word for his condition, any of you who wish to, though I would not weight it heavily. She names the furniture and reads him fairy stories in silly voices, a kind enough creature. Not a serious one, doctor, if you would." Emmerich lifted the pen. His hand shook. "That is the second thing you have gotten wrong tonight." "Bastiano," said Lucio Durante. His voice went out across the great hall like a blade drawn slow and clean from a sheath, low and level and utterly terribly awake, and every single head in the room came around toward the chair. The fog was gone from his eyes as though it had never once been in them. He lifted his head off the wing of the chair. He set his hands on the arms of it, and he pushed himself up straight, and 15 captains who had filed into that hall to bury a vegetable found themselves looking instead at the man who had made every one of them, wide awake and looking coldly back. The silence that fell was absolute. It was the old silence. "For 2 years," Lucio said into that ringing quiet, and he did not raise his voice, because he had never in his life needed to, "I have been drowning in whatever this man and that doctor have been putting into my cup 3 times every day. Not sick, though they told you sick. Not grieving my legs, though they told you that too. Drugged, kept, emptied out on a schedule so that I would sign whatever was set in front of my shaking hand, and follow nothing, and ask no questions, and slip away quietly and lawfully on the 1st of the month, while he sold the river you all bled for to the men across the water." He raised his right hand, and it did not shake, not at all. And in it was the small black recorder. "You do not have to take the girl's word for any of it. She is far more serious than he told you. But you do not need her. Take his. Take his own." He pressed it. Bastiano's warm, easy, comfortable voice filled the great stone hall. "The Sarkis papers, the river frontage and the North Dock, the 1st of the month." And then, into the held breath of 15 listening men, the soft, untroubled laugh, and a man in his condition, and these things happen, and no one is going to look twice at a sick man in a chair who finally stops fighting. When it clicked off, no one in the room breathed. "He arranged to be rid of me like a delivery," Lucio said quietly into the silence, "for the convenience of a man across the water. And make no mistake about where you are all standing tonight. Yours would have come later, each of you, on whatever morning he decided he no longer needed you." He turned his clear, cold eyes on Emmerich, who had gone. "The vials from your bag are in the nurse's keeping, doctor. They will not match a single line written anywhere on that chart, and you know it. I would put the pen down and sit, if I were you. Your hand is shaking worse than mine ever did. It broke then, the way rotten things break." Emmerich was suddenly talking, babbling, the pen clattering to the table. It was Pharaoh. It was all Pharaoh. He ordered it. He only did what he was told to do. He had a family. The Sarkis emissary was already moving, already stepping quietly backward toward the tall doors, wanting no part now of a deal built on a corpse that had sat up and started naming names. And the captains, the 15 hard men who had obeyed Bastiano Ferro for 2 years only because there had been no other voice left in the house to obey, turned as one single body toward the head of the room, and the look on their faces was not soft, and it was not confused, and it was not loyal. Bastiano's hand went inside his coat. Renzo, who had come back up from the docks and slipped in quiet through the river door at Linea's back, was faster, and had a heavy scarred hand locked around the smaller man's wrist before he could clear it from the cloth. And then two of the old crew had his arms, and the whole of it was over so quickly and so quietly that it was almost gentle. They held Bastiano Ferro upright before the chair. All the warmth had finally drained out of his face, all of it at once, and what was left underneath when it was gone was small and frightened and had been there the entire time, under the smile, for 11 years. A nurse, he said. Even now, even held, it came out as a sneer. 11 years I gave to this. 11 years of patience. And you let a temporary nurse undo the whole of it. A girl who names the furniture and reads you stories. Lucio looked up at the man who had carried his father's coffin, the man who had steadied his shaking hand around a pen for 2 years, while he robbed him blind, and there was nothing merciful anywhere in his face. But there was no heat in it either. There was only the cold, final, settled weight of a sentence being passed by a man who had the standing to pass it. You should have been far more afraid of the woman who could make me laugh, Lucio said, than of any man alive who could make me bleed. She did not simply tend me, she woke me. That is the one single thing all your careful papers could not stop, because you did not know to write it down and forbid it, and it is the thing that has finished you. He turned his eyes away from the man, deliberately, and that turning away was its own kind of ending. Worse than any word. Take him out. He does not get the river. He does not get the quiet, dignified, painless exit he picked out so carefully for me. Renzo knows what he gets. They took Bastiano Ferro out of the great hall, and he did not laugh, and he did not smile, and the men who carried him between them had waited a very long time to stop pretending they respected him. The lean man in the expensive coat was already gone into the dark, and Lucio Durante sat in the center of his own hall, in his own chair, alive and awake and holding the whole of it in his 2 hands again, and he lifted his eyes across all of it to the plain nurse standing quiet by the far wall as though she were the only other person in the entire room. The house learned how to make sound again slowly, the way Lucio himself had learned to close his own hand. In the days after the council, Virio House filled up, little by little, with the ordinary noise of a place where people actually lived. The curtains stayed open now, all of them, and the clean river light came in off the Calder and lay in long gold bars across the marble floors that had been kept so carefully, so deliberately dim. The captains came one by one to stand before the chair and swear the old oath over again, and Lucio received them exactly the way Renzo had once described the old Lucio, missing nothing, forgetting no one, raising his voice at no man, and needing to raise it at none. He did not walk. Linnea had been careful and honest with him about that from the very first clear hour, and once the first fury had burned down, he had been clear-eyed and unflinching about it himself. The water had taken his legs, and no amount of laughter and no amount of justice was ever going to give them back to him. What the drugs had stolen could be returned, the sharpness, the will, the feeling in his hands, the self. What the river had taken was gone for good. He would run his empire from that chair for the rest of his life, and the men who came to swear to him learned quickly that it made him not 1 degree less to be feared. She loved him a little more, if she was honest, for how plainly and how quietly he faced that fact, with no bitterness left over in him to poison everything else. Lucio had grieved it once, fully, in private, and then set it down, and picked up the living. It was Dr. Emmerich, in the end, kept on a very short leash and frightened at last into plain honesty, who confirmed what Linnea had first begun to suspect in the garden. Off the drugging, with real food and real light and real care and real reason to wake in the morning, Lucio came back to himself, a little more with every week that passed. Some of the numbness even eased out of his hands, so that his grip grew sure, and he built up hard through the chest and the shoulders and the arms in a way that, Emmerich admitted, would matter a great deal to a man who intended to live the rest of his life in a chair. It was not a miracle. Linnea had promised him no miracles, and he had wanted none. It was only a man being given back the pieces of himself that had been chemically drowned, and becoming, week by week, as whole as he was ever going to get. And that Linnea thought, watching him grow back into his own face, was worth a great deal more than a miracle would have been, precisely because it was real and earned. Her own walls, as it turned out, came down harder than his ever had. She had told herself the whole way through it that she was only the temporary girl, the caregiver, the hired hands, the woman with no family, and one good name to guard, and a car always, eventually waiting at the bottom of the drive to take her back to the quiet flat where no one laughed and nothing needed her. She had refused him a when in the garden because she had not dared to let herself want one. In the end, it was Lucio who reached up and took the wall down, one evening in that same garden, with the light going gold and long over the river, and the first cool of the coming autumn in the air. "You are not going back to the agency," he said. It was not quite a question, and it was not quite an order, and it was a little of both, which was very like him. "I have watched you get quietly ready to leave since the first afternoon you got here. Do not go, Linnea. There is nothing in that quiet flat waiting for you but the quiet, and there is everything here. Stay, not as a nurse. I have nurses. Stay because this house was a tomb with me sealed up alive inside it, until the day you walked in off the drive with an orange in your pocket and threw open a window. And I find that I am not willing to let anyone in this world close it again. Least of all you. I do not know how to stay anywhere," she said. And she said it honestly, because he had only ever asked her for honest things. "That is the truth of me, Lucio, and you should have it before you ask again. I care for people, I give them everything I have, and then I leave. Always, before it can cost me anything, to lose them. I have been doing it since my father. It is the only way I have ever found to survive the work." "I know," he said. "I know exactly, because I have been doing the very same thing from this chair for 2 years, in my own way. Being afraid to feel one single thing, because to feel anything at all meant admitting out loud what I had lost, and I could not afford to. So I understand you better than you think." He reached out and took her hand, and his grip was sure and warm and strong now, no fog left anywhere in it. All of him, there in it. "We are neither one of us any good at staying, you and I. We are both of us far too practiced at leaving first, so let us be bad at leaving together, instead of being good at it apart." She laughed. It came up out of her easy and whole and unguarded, the way it used to come before the quiet flat and the 2 silent years, the exact laugh her father had given her, and that she had believed, truly believed, she had buried in the ground along with him. And Lucio Durante closed his eyes and tipped his head back and listened to the sound of it the way he had listened, that first stolen afternoon, to the sun on his face in this same garden. Like a man who had been entirely certain, for a very long time, that he would never in his life get to hear that particular sound again. "There it is," he said softly, without opening his eyes, giving her back her own words from the 3rd day. "I was starting to think they had it stuffed and mounted." She peeled an orange in the last of the gold light and split it in 2, and put a piece of it into his open hand. And this time, instead of stepping back, she leaned in and kissed him, slow and certain, and neither one of them ever again, from that evening to the end of their days, made the smallest pretense that any of it had ever been nursing. There was one call left to make, and Lucio made it himself, in a clear, cold, even voice, from behind the desk in the study that was once again and past all argument, entirely his own. Halvard Sarkis answered on the 2nd ring, and whatever it was, his lean emissary had carried back to him out of that great hall, it had traveled fast, because the voice that came down the line was not the smooth, confident voice of a patriarch buying up a river. It was the careful voice of a man who had reached his hand into a box he had been assured was safe, and felt something living move against his fingers in the dark. "Durante," Sarkis said, I had heard you were unwell. I had heard the very same, Lucio said. It turned out to be a rumor, started, as it happens, by a man who is no longer in any position to spread rumors, or anything else. I am calling you as a courtesy, Halvard. I am calling to tell you that the arrangement Pharaoh sold to you is dead. It is dead, and buried in the same ground he is, and it is not coming up. The river is not for sale. It never was for sale. It was never once his to sell you, and you knew that. A short pause, to let the man do his arithmetic, so hear the rest of it plainly. If one of your trucks, if one of your men, if one single crate of your product so much as touches my water after tonight, I am not going to send you a message about it. I am not going to call. I am going to arrive. And you have just spent good money learning what happens to men who believed I was finished. There was a silence on the line, and inside the silence, Lucio could hear, distinctly, the sound of a hard and careful man running the whole sum a second time. The river is yours, Halvard Sarkis said at last. It always was yours, Lucio. There was never any trouble here. Pharaoh misrepresented the situation to me, and I will be having my own words with the memory of him for it. No, Lucio agreed pleasantly. There is no trouble here. Let us both of us keep it that way. Do not ever make me remember that for 1 week it could have gone otherwise. And he set the telephone down gently in its cradle, without waiting 1 second for the answer, because the man who could make a whole room fall silent by setting down a glass had never once in his life needed to have the last word. He needed only for the room to know, past all doubt, who was still standing in it. The rest of it settled out over the weeks that followed. Dr. Emmerich left the country, ahead of a set of questions he could not have survived answering. Signora Celine Dre was gone from Vireo House by the end of the first week, quietly, without a scene, to wherever it is that cold and careful people go when the thing they had chosen to serve falls out from under them. And Bastiano Ferro was not seen again anywhere by anyone, and the men who had carried him out of the great hall that night did not speak of it, and the city, which had been so entirely certain that it knew exactly how Lucio Durante was going to end, was quietly and thoroughly obliged to understand. On a bright, cool morning at the very turn of the season, on the first of the month that was to have been his last, Lucio Durante sat out in the walled garden above the Calder with the sun full and warm on his face, and his empire whole and quiet around him, and the woman who had raised him up out of the dead sitting on the grass at his side, peeling an orange in the light. The house behind them was loud with the ordinary noise of living. Somewhere inside it, a radio was playing something, and Renzo was laughing at something else, a great, helpless, rolling sound, and the curtains stood wide open in every single window so that the light could get all the way in and stay. He had asked, once, for a quiet caregiver, a calm, incurious, undemanding woman who would feed him and mind the schedule and keep the room and let him disappear, decently and on time. That was what all of them had wanted for him. In the end, the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who let a man slip under the water without ever once making a fuss about it. And instead, by an accident of the calendar and a leave taken upstate, the agency had sent him the loudest, warmest, most stubborn, and least quiet person he had ever met in the whole of his life. A woman who threw open his curtains and read him lawyers' threats in a mournful villain's voice and refused, flatly and completely, and every single day, to leave a man where she had found him. She had carried a bruised orange and a terrible opera voice into a sealed gray tomb, and she had made a dead man laugh, and the laughing had gone and done the one thing that no soldier and no weapon and no clever midnight plan had managed to do in 2 long years. It had woken the dead all the way up, and that is how a man they had already buried came back and took hold of every last thing they had stolen out of his hands, and never once had to raise his voice to do it. Because the single deadliest thing in that whole cold and beautiful house in the end turned out not to be a knife or a gun or a good clean lie, told with a warm smile. It turned out to be the sound of a hard man learning, against all his careful enemies' plans, how to laugh again. If this story warmed something in you tonight, if you believe, the way I have come to believe, that the quiet and the stubborn and the joyful ones are the strongest people in any room they walk into. And subscribe to the channel for more stories where the ones the world writes off as harmless turn out to be holding all the power the whole. And tell me down in the comments, I truly want to know, what was the exact moment you knew that Bastiano had already lost? I will see you in the next one.